Hi, everyone. My name is Daniella Gonzalez, and I am the Energy and Climate Fellow at the Wilderness Society. The Wilderness Society is an organization that works to promote conservation of public lands in the U.S. and make public lands a part of the climate solution. I am currently based in Washington, D.C., and before we begin, would like to acknowledge that this is the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples, and perhaps others of which we are ignorant. Indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and traveled here since time immemorial. We respect their communities, past, present, and future, and recognize them as the original peoples of these lands. We are grateful for their deep knowledge and ongoing stewardship of the lands, waters, and wildlife across the region. Now, before we dig in, let's talk about climate change. Climate change is the universal environmental and social justice issue of our time, and the science is clearer than ever. Immediate action is needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. In order to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050, the world must rapidly phase out fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy. We need to act now, and public lands are one place the federal government can act immediately to tackle the problem. So the first question that I have for you is, do you know what public lands are? First and foremost, the places we know as public lands today are the ancestral homelands of Indigenous people who have stewarded them for generations. And Indigenous communities remain deeply connected to and reliant on these places, even though their ancestors were forcibly removed from them. Today, the term public lands refers to lands open to the public and collectively owned by the public, managed by the government at the local, state, and national levels. Public lands aren't just national parks. National forests and local city parks count as public lands too. This is a map of federal public lands in the US. Most public land is in the western half of the US because the US was settled east to west. Now that we're clear on what public lands are and where they are in the US, here's a follow-up question. How many acres of our federal public lands do you think are leased to oil and gas developers? More than 26 million acres of public lands are leased to oil and gas developers. This is the area about the size of Tennessee. So at this point, you may be asking, how is this possible? Because contrary to popular belief, public lands do not mean protected lands. The public in public lands and waters means that the government is legally supposed to manage them in the public's interest. But allowing them to fuel a climate catastrophe is not in anyone's interest. Plus, a lot of the land that is leased to oil and gas developers hasn't been developed, but this means it won't be managed for recreation, conservation, and other uses. So you may be asking, how much of the US climate emissions can we trace back to public lands? Nearly 1/4 of all of the US carbon emissions come from fossil fuel developed in our public lands and waters. In fact, if public lands and waters were a country, they would be number 5 compared to the rest of the world in carbon emissions. To make matters worse, under the Trump administration, large swaths of public lands were open to the oil and gas development, including ecologically important regions like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This reckless oil and gas drilling threatens wildlife, air, and water quality, and human health, with a disproportionate effect on communities of color and Indigenous communities. Now, the Biden administration has the power to make sure that these lands are protected and part of the climate solution. But despite the campaign promise to ban new oil and gas permitting on public lands and water, Biden's administration has issued over 3,500 new drilling permits so far. Many conservation groups are now calling on Biden to rein in the oil and gas development on public lands to meet the US climate goals. Now let's talk about solutions. Here at TWS, we're working towards zero emissions from public lands by 2050 at the latest while ensuring a just economic transition for frontline and fossil fuel reliant communities. We also have a big opportunity to support more solutions through responsible renewable energy development on public lands and protecting mature and old growth forests that absorb and store large quantities of carbon. Now we'll get the chance to hear from Olivia Juarez from Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance and Lauren Berutich from Great Oak Broadsford Wilderness, who are both a part of a People, Public Land, and Climate Collaborative about ways that their organizations and communities are working to make public lands a part for the climate solution.
Thank you, Daniella. Hi, everybody. I'm Olivia Juarez, representing the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. Utah is the site of 9 million acres of Great Basin and Colorado Plateau wildlands. We are making public lands a solution to the climate crisis rather than a part of the problem by advocating for America's Red Rock Wilderness Act. The lands in Utah, administered by the Bureau of Land Management, exist as a regional solution to the climate crisis, but only if they are allowed to thrive in their natural state. These 9 million acres of BLM wildlands will store 271 million metric tons of organic carbon in plants and soils by the end of the century. That equals the mass of more than 200,000 of the world's largest sequoia tree, the General Sherman tree. Naturally functioning dryland ecosystems are important for sequestering the excess carbon in our atmosphere that's causing drought and severe warming. To maintain healthy functioning ecosystems, preserve biodiversity, and mitigate impacts from climate change, we need to protect more land. And the benefits increase dramatically when we protect large landscapes that connect ecosystems and wildlife habitat. America's Red Rock Wilderness Act accounts for 1.5% of the remaining land that needs to be conserved to reach the goal of protecting 30% of land in the United States by 2030. You can be a part of the national call to make Red Rock Wilderness a climate crisis solution. Text ARRWA to the number 52886 and follow the link to email your members of Congress and ask for their co-sponsorship of America's Red Rock Wilderness Act. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Lauren?
Thanks, Olivia. Hi, my name is Lauren Berutich, Associate Director for Great Oak Broadsford Wilderness. Thanks so much for having me. Great Oak Broadsford Wilderness is a national grassroots organization led by women that engages and inspires activism to preserve and protect wilderness and wild lands. Broads gives voice to the millions of concerned community members who want to protect their public lands and wilderness for this and future generations. We bring knowledge, leadership, and humor to the wilderness preservation movement. And we're educating communities about the critical connections between healthy public lands and climate change mitigation. We believe that public lands can be and must be a part of the solution to the climate crisis. In 2019, we initiated a new program, CESA, Climate Education, Stewardship, and Advocacy, with the goal of educating and engaging the public in a deep dive to public lands management and how this impacts the climate. Through the program to date, we've hosted 14 public events and stewardship projects, including a planting of over 500 trees. We've monitored invasive species, rivers, and timber sales, and organized a 45-person multi-day educational event on the Olympic Peninsula to study climate impacts on forests and coasts. We've hosted over 10 webinars and new partners and built new partnerships and coalitions. We've launched a curriculum for climate and public lands education, initiating new ecological restoration projects on public lands across the Northwest, and we're expanding. Both in person and online, Broads engaged over 300 people in hands-on climate education and stewardship experiences and totaled over 2,000 hours of engagement. We are actively participating in public policy and key legislation aimed to keep wildlands wild, healthy forests intact, and with campaigns to protect public lands from further fossil fuel development. We believe in the Biden administration's goal to protect 30% of the land by 2030, and in his America the Beautiful vision This year, Broad's national office has prioritized over 3 million acres of campaigns for public lands wilderness designation, wild and scenic river preservation, and public lands protection. We need your collective voices, and together we can make a difference. So please go to our website at greatoldbroads.org, sign up as a member, join our action alerts, and see how your voice can make a difference.
Great. Thanks so much, the two of you. And thank you guys so much for joining us. And make sure to click the links in the chat to take further action.